The availability of instrumentation is important because ionizing radiation cannot readily be identified without instrumentation. Conversely, radiation can easily be identified and quantified with the appropriate instruments. Radioactivity and the emission of radiation are essentially radioactive materials releasing energy. Unstable atoms may emit radiation in the form of physical subatomic particles, such as alpha or beta particles, or electromagnetic waves, such as gamma radiation. A radioactive source some distance from your body can emit radiation, primarily gamma radiation, that will travel through the air and impact on your body. The radiation exposure will cease once you're away from the source of radiation. If you swallow or inhale radioactive material, the radiation will now be emitted from inside your body. The radiation exposure will continue until the radioactive material has been eliminated from inside your body by natural processes. Once the radioactive material is inside your body, the cells may be affected by alpha, beta, or gamma radiation. We are constantly exposed to small amounts of ionizing radiation from the environment. This radiation is known as natural background radiation. Natural background radiation has always been present and is all around us. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, otherwise known as UNSCEAR, identifies that there are 4 major sources of public exposure to natural radiation. These include cosmic radiation, terrestrial radiation, inhalation, and ingestion. A person's dose to natural sources of radiation vary depending on their location and habits. In Canada, most people are exposed in the range of 2 to 3 millisieverts each year. The sievert is a unit that will be covered in further detail in slides to come. Know for now that the unit sievert is used to express the amount of radiation dose a body receives. The following video, called Radiological Basics, was produced by the Department of Energy and the Transportation Emergency Preparedness Program, otherwise known as TEP.
In order to understand the radiation hazard, a brief explanation of basic atomic structure in radiation terminology is needed. The atom is a basic unit of matter, or the simplest structure of an element. Atoms consist of varying combinations of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons and neutrons are found in the nucleus, or center portion of an atom, while the electrons orbit around the nucleus. If the combination of protons and neutrons is not correct, the nucleus will have too much energy. An atom with too much energy is unstable or radioactive. These radioactive atoms will try to become stable by giving up their excess energy. This excess energy is emitted in a form of particles or waves and is called ionizing radiation. Not all types of radiation have enough energy to ionize other atoms. For example, radar waves, radio waves, microwaves, and visible light are all types of radiation, but they are non-ionizing radiations. Radioactivity is a term used to describe the spontaneous emission of energy or radiation from a radioactive atom. If a material contains radioactive atoms, it is called radioactive material. If that material is in an unwanted or uncontrolled location, it is referred to as radioactive contamination. Contamination and radiation are not the same. Exposure to radiation will not make you contaminated, nor would you become radioactive. If you are exposed to radiation, you do not have the potential to expose other people. Remember, radiation is energy emitted from radioactive atoms. Contamination is material containing radioactive atoms. Let me give you some examples of these concepts. If a radioactive material is properly contained in a package, radiation could still penetrate through the packaging. If you handle that package, you could be exposed to radiation. Once you distance yourself from the package, you would no longer be exposed. However, if the package breaks open and the contents spill onto the floor would be contaminated. If you stepped in the spilled material and it transferred to your feet, you would then be contaminated and have the potential to spread that contamination as you walk. Keep in mind that the material that is contaminating you is emitting radiation, so you are exposed to radiation as well. Again, radiation is the energy, contamination is the material. While responding to an incident involving radioactive materials, the potential exists for you to receive exposure to radiation or become contaminated. In other modules, you'll learn how to reduce your exposure and control the spread of contamination.
Alpha and beta particles are important to consider if a container has been breached or if there is any loose, uncontained radioactive material. Gamma radiation is much more penetrating, as some gamma radiation will even go through container walls made of lead or steel. External gamma radiation is the most probable immediate hazard during a radiation emergency. External gamma radiation can be measured easily using the appropriate instrument. Various guidelines generally provide action levels based on the measured external gamma radiation dose rates and the anticipated external gamma radiation doses. Control measures to minimize internal radiation exposure are similar to those of a chemical hazard. The advantage to controlling a radiological spill is that radiation is easy to monitor, measure, and control. The following video, 4 types of ionizing radiation, was produced by the Department of Energy and TEP. The video will make mention of neutrons. Though we haven't discussed them up to this point, understand they behave very much like gamma radiation in that they are very penetrating. The common neutron source will show up on a general purpose radiation meter.
As a first responder, you may be required to respond to an incident involving radioactive materials. These materials could emit one or more of the 4 types of ionizing radiation. To protect yourself and others who may be involved, a basic understanding of ionizing radiation is important. There are 4 main types of ionizing radiation. They are alpha radiation, beta radiation, neutron radiation, and gamma rays or X-rays. Let's take a minute and look at each of these. Alpha radiation is a large charged particle that consists of 2 protons and 2 neutrons. These particles can travel only 1 to 2 inches in air and are easily shielded by a single sheet of paper. In fact, alpha particles will not penetrate the outer layer of skin cells on your body, so they are not considered an external hazard. However, if a material that emits alpha radiation is taken into the body, it can, because of the close proximity, cause damage to body tissues. For this reason, alpha radiation is considered an internal hazard. Beta radiation is a small charged particle. Beta particles are much smaller than alpha particles and can travel up to 10 feet in air. They can penetrate into the skin layers and are considered a skin and eye hazard. But they can also be an internal hazard if a material that emits beta radiation is introduced into the body. Beta radiation can be shielded by plastic, aluminum, or several layers of clothing. A firefighter's turnout gear or bunker gear will provide some shielding from beta radiation. In general, alpha and beta radiation are associated with contamination. Neutron radiation is a neutrally charged particle that can travel several hundred feet in air. Neutron particles have a high penetrating ability and can penetrate through the body. Therefore, they are considered a whole body hazard. To shield neutron radiation, high hydrogen content materials such as water or plastic are used. Gamma ray or X-ray radiation is an electromagnetic wave or photon rather than a particle. Because gamma rays and X-rays have no mass and no charge, they have a high penetrating ability, are able to travel several hundred feet in air, and penetrate through the body. They are considered a whole body hazard. Very dense materials such as lead, concrete, or steel are used to shield gamma and X-ray radiation. Because of their penetrating ability, it would not be uncommon to see neutron and gamma radiation penetrate through an intact package without any contamination being present. An understanding of the different types of ionizing radiation will help you minimize your risk when responding to an accident involving radioactive materials.
To recap, alpha and beta particles in general are internal hazards and associated with contamination, where neutrons and gamma radiation are considered whole body hazards. Radiation units can be confusing. The industry uses different units to describe the same quantity and yet may use one unit to describe different quantities. I want you to understand that sometimes we measure the amount of radiation and other times we measure the amount of radioactive material. The unit becquerel measures the amount of stuff that gives off radiation, while the unit sievert measures the radiation interaction with your body. These are the units we will refer to in this course, the becquerel and the sievert. As a responder, you want to limit the amount of radiation you receive. You also want to limit the amount of radioactive material that is spread around. The next video we'll watch, Time, Distance, and Shielding, was also developed by the Department of Energy and TEP.
There are 3 protection principles that you, as a responder, can apply to minimize your exposure. They are time, distance, and shielding. Time. Minimizing your time in a field of radiation is an important factor in radiation protection. The shorter the amount of time you spend in a field of radiation, the lower the radiation dose you will receive. If you are not productively engaged in victim recovery or accident scene response, stay out of the areas with elevated radiation. If you are manning the radio or telephone, do it in a low or no radiation area. The second protection principle is distance. No matter how far the radiation can travel, your exposure will always be greatly reduced when you move away from the source of radiation. The farther away from the source of radiation you stay, the lower your dose will be. Shielding is the third protection principle. Different materials are used to shield different types of radiation. In general, the denser a material, the greater its ability to stop the passage of radiation. You can shield yourself by placing your vehicle, a mound of dirt, or available heavy equipment between you and the radiation source. Remember that clothing and turnout gear is sufficient to stop alpha and some beta radiation emitted by materials if they are present, but it does nothing to stop gamma radiation. Shielding is not always practical during emergency field operation. The identification and evaluation of victims and the administration of emergency care should not be delayed to seek shielding materials. To summarize the 3 protection principles: spend as little time as possible in the immediate danger area, maintain a distance from the radioactive material, and wear protective clothing and use available shielding when possible and practical.
Health effects, and therefore dose limits, are related to radiation dose. But most instruments measure dose rate. The two are related as dose equals the dose rate times time. For example, you can be in a 1 millisievert per hour radiation field for an hour before you reach the public dose limit. Alternatively, you could spend 1,000 hours in a 1 microsievert per hour dose rate before you reach that same public dose limit of a millisievert. What this means is that you can limit the dose you receive by limiting the time that you spend in a high dose rate area. Now luckily, you don't have to remember limits or do any math in your head. Our instruments will do all this work for you. But I do want to go slow here and make sure you understand the concept of limiting your dose and not the dose rate. For example, dose rate during an X-ray or a CAT scan is very high, but you can limit your dose by limiting your exposure time. This is the same approach that we use for emergency situations. Dose rates can be quite high as long as you don't spend a lot of time there. I know this seems a bit counterintuitive. A lot of times we take an instantaneous reading and decide whether something is safe or not. For example, you might measure the temperature of a cup of coffee and decide that it's too hot to drink. You wouldn't say that it's too hot to drink, but maybe if I just drink it fast enough. But that's exactly what we do here. Any health effects from radiation are due to dose, which again is calculated by multiplying a dose rate by an occupancy time. This is a really important radiation concept to understand, as we are more used to taking a reading like temperature, and based on that reading, we decide if it's safe or not. With radiation, we take a reading, and based on that reading, we decide how long we can be in the area. We know more about the health risks associated with radiation than any other chemical or otherwise toxic agent. We're not guessing here. Radiation has been studied in depth. We know that if you expose an organism to a large enough dose of radiation, it will get sick or die. If you expose a population to high enough doses of radiation, you will see an increase in the number of cancers. At low doses, we assume that the risk is proportional to dose. But the risk is so low that you don't see any effect in real populations. So, at what dose level is the health effect so small that it cannot be detected? Well, that level is around 80 to 100 millisieverts. Below that level, either there is no negative health effect or it's just too small to observe. In fact, some people think that the data actually is consistent with a health benefit at low doses. Note that the average Canadian natural background dose is above the public dose limit. That's because the public dose limit excludes natural background radiation as well as any dose received as a result of medical procedures. There is variation on background dose. For example, background radiation doses on the prairies are about double the national average. The following video, The Biological Effects of Radiation, is another production of the Department of Energy and TEP. The video uses old units. They mention 10 rem. 10 rem is the same as 100 millisieverts or 100,000 microsieverts.
Probably of most interest to you, the responder, is, what can radiation do to me? The effects of ionizing radiation on the body occur at the cellular level throughout the day. Every day of our lives, we have cells forming, dividing, and dying as a normal occurrence. Some cells are more sensitive than others to environmental factors such as viruses, toxins, and ionizing radiation. Cells in our body that are actively dividing are more sensitive to ionizing radiation. Cells that are rapidly dividing include blood-forming cells, the cells that line our intestinal tract, hair follicles, and the developing embryo or fetus. The cells which are dividing at a slower rate or are more specialized, such as brain cells or muscle cells, are not as sensitive to damage by ionizing radiation. Radiation doses have two classifications, acute and chronic. An acute dose is where a large amount of radiation is received over a short period of time. The physical effects, such as reduced blood count and hair loss, are due to massive cell damage and the body's inability to repair or replace the cells fast enough. An example would be someone undergoing radiation treatment for cancer. The cancer cells are rapidly dividing and are therefore sensitive to the ionizing radiation. While this is a high dose of radiation administered within a short period of time, it's focused upon a small, specific portion of the body. After an acute dose, damaged cells will be replaced by new cells, and the body will begin to repair itself, although this may take a number of months. The probability of an emergency responder receiving an acute dose of ionizing radiation is extremely low. A chronic dose is typically radiation received over a long period of time. For example, we receive a chronic dose from natural background radiation every day of our lives. The body is better equipped to handle a chronic dose than an acute dose. This is due to two factors. There are fewer cells to repair at any one time, and the body has time to replace dead or non-functioning cells with new ones. A chronic dose of radiation may not result in detectable physical changes as might be seen with an acute dose. However, it is highly unlikely that responders would experience detectable physical changes from an acute dose received at the scene of a transportation accident involving radiological materials. Epidemiological studies have not demonstrated adverse health effects in individuals exposed to small doses of less than 10 rem delivered in a period of many years.